He thought his twin daughters were lost forever, dead to him for 3 long years. Then one day, on a dusty bus rolling through a forgotten town, he found them singing. But the truth he uncovered didn't just break his heart, it shattered his entire life before the story even began. Tell us where you're watching this video in the comments below. And if these kinds of stories touch you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. Now, sit back and let the story unfold. The sun had barely brushed the horizon when I found myself riding into a town no one spoke kindly of. Dust Hollow. I was only passing through, or so I told myself, even though my bones ached from the weight of years and the ghosts I carried. My horse's hooves kicked up a cloud of dry dirt as the wagon creaked beneath me, every groan like a reminder of all I'd lost and all I still had to lose. The town was little more than a cluster of weather-beaten buildings clinging to cracked earth. The saloon sign swung in the brittle wind, paint peeling, like everything here had been forgotten on purpose. Folks loitered on porches or leaned against walls, eyes sharp but wary. As if the dust carried more than just the dryness of the desert, it carried stories no one dared tell aloud. My grip on the reins tightened as I passed the cracked well in the center of the square, and that's when I saw a cage. Old iron bars, rusted and bent, sitting like a relic in the middle of the dirt. Straw littered the floor, and inside slumped a man, shoulders stooped, head bowed low like the weight of the world pressed down on him. His bare feet rested on the dirt, his shirt torn, wrists bound by what looked like strips of worn leather. I moved closer, boots stirring dust and grit, until I stood just inches from the cage's edge. The man's dark eyes lifted, not wild or pleading, but steady and weary. Like someone who had given up hope long ago but still held on to the smallest shard of something, maybe trust, maybe a flicker of something better. I reached into my satchel, fingers brushing against the cold metal of a ring I'd carried for years. It was the only thing left of a past I wasn't ready to forget but had learned to carry quietly. A wedding ring, thin and worn from a lifetime of wear, a symbol of a promise broken but not erased. Holding the ring up, I offered it without a word to the man behind the bars. The crowd hushed, the air thick with a silence that spoke louder than any shout. The sheriff, leaning against a post nearby, scoffed and took the ring, weighing it in the sunlight like it was nothing more than a trinket. "Not worth $10, he sneered, "but it'll buy you a tale." With a creak and a scrape, the cage door swung open. The man did not move at first. "He's yours now," the sheriff said with a smirk. "Hope you've got rope and regrets." I stepped forward, just beyond the cage. "You can come or stay, but you're not anyone's anymore." The man pushed himself up slowly, legs stiff and shaky, taller than I'd expected. Sunlight caught his face, dark hair matted, a thick beard shadowing his jaw, eyes deep and unreadable. He stepped out without a word. No one stopped us. No one spoke. The wagon wheels groaned as we pulled away from Dust Hollow, the town shrinking behind us like a bad memory. The road ahead was long and silent. He never asked where we were headed, never asked for food or water, never spoke. When night fell, I made camp by a cold stream. He moved quietly, gathering wood, tending the fire without a word. We settled into a rhythm unspoken, uncertain, but steady. There were no promises made that night. Only a shared silence, a fire burning low, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, we were both free from cages we couldn't see. The morning light stretched across the land like a thin veil, soft and hesitant. It wasn't the kind of dawn that promised miracles, but it was enough. Enough to pull me from restless sleep and to remind me that the road was still waiting, endless and dry as the years I carried behind me. The man I'd freed, though I still didn't know his name, was already awake before me, crouched by the dwindling embers of our fire, scraping at a piece of dry wood with a worn blade. His movements were deliberate, silent, as though every action was part of some long-forgotten ritual. I watched him, the way the morning sun struck his rough hands, the way his dark eyes flicked up only once to meet mine, and then turned back to the task. There was a weight in the silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was necessary. Words felt like a gamble neither of us was ready to take. Yet something in his presence felt like a fragile bridge, one built not of promises or explanations, but of quiet understanding. I packed up camp slowly, my fingers still tender from nights spent clutching a worn satchel and days spent steering a creaking wagon down forgotten trails. The man moved alongside me without asking, his shadow falling long over the cracked earth. He gathered the remaining embers from the fire and crushed them beneath his boot, making sure no trace was left behind except for the faint scent of smoke carried away by the breeze. The road ahead was a dusty ribbon cutting through a harsh landscape of sagebrush and twisted mesquite. I kept my eyes fixed on it, but the landscape was etched with memories I couldn't outrun. I thought about the ring I had traded, the thin gold band smoothed by years of wear, now resting in the hands of a man who had no name, but carried a story heavier than any chains. The man rode beside me, silent, his eyes scanning the horizon like a sentinel who had learned the hard way that the world was a place where trust was a currency more scarce than water. I sensed his history was carved deep beneath the surface, each scar and crease telling a chapter I was yet to read. We passed a dry creek bed where the earth had cracked wide, and the bones of old travelers lay hidden beneath sun-bleached rocks. I stopped the wagon to let the horse drink, and for a moment, the man hesitated before stepping down. He moved with a quiet grace, as if the very act of walking carried the weight of things unsaid. That night, under a sky thick with stars, I watched him carve something into a slab of cedar wood, the blade moving with precision and care. The carving was simple, yet intricate, a lone raven, its wings folded, perched as if guarding a secret. He didn't speak, but his eyes flicked toward me briefly, holding a question that didn't need words. I traced the shape with my fingers when he handed it to me, feeling the rough grain beneath my skin. The raven wasn't just a bird. It was a symbol, a witness, a sentinel watching over broken things. I thought of my own past, a past littered with loss and silence, and wondered if, like the raven, we were both survivors watching from the shadows, waiting for a chance to fly free again. Days bled into one another. We traveled through ghost towns where windows were shattered and doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. I saw the man's eyes darken each time we passed a burned-out homestead or a graveyard filled with crooked crosses. I didn't ask. Some wounds were too raw, stories too bitter to be spoken aloud. Instead, I carried my own silence, a cloak woven from years of pain and resilience. I thought about the man's quiet strength, how he moved without hesitation, how he protected the small fire we shared each night, how he repaired the wagon's broken wheel with hands that seemed more accustomed to fighting than fixing. The bond between us grew without fanfare, without promises. It was in the small things, the way he covered me with a blanket when the desert chill crept in, the way he hunted with steady hands, returning with game to fill our empty stomachs. It was in the quiet moments beside the fire, where glances exchanged spoke louder than any words. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with bruised hues of purple and gold, I found him sitting by the fire, whittling another figure out of cedar. This one was different, a wolf, sleek and fierce, its eyes sharp and unyielding. I watched him for a long time, feeling the weight of the wilderness in that carving. The wolf was not just an animal, it was a reflection of something primal inside both of us. Something wild, scarred, and stubborn enough to survive against all odds. I reached into my satchel and pulled out the empty pouch that once held my ring. I tied it shut with a thin piece of string and placed it carefully beside the fire. It was a quiet offering, a symbol of what I had traded and what I was willing to let go of. The man's eyes met mine, steady and dark. No words were spoken, but in that moment, I felt something shift, a fragile truce between the past and the future, between the cages we carried and the freedom we sought. That night, I fell asleep with the wolf carving resting on my lap, the warmth of the fire mingling with the heat of something new stirring inside me. It was not hope, exactly not yet, but the faintest glimmer of possibility. The road ahead was still long, and the shadows deep. But for the first time in a long while, I felt less alone. We rode on. The horizon stretched like an unbroken promise, but the weight of the past clung to us like the dust in the air. I learned quickly that freedom was not a place on a map. It was the space between moments, the breath caught between one sorrow and the next. The man I carried beside me, still nameless, remained an enigma wrapped in silence. His presence was steady, like the slow beat of a distant drum constant, unyielding but never demanding. It was in the quiet that I came to know him best. Not through words, but through the small gestures that defined the kind of bond that words could never build. One afternoon, we crossed a shallow river, its cold water biting at the horses' legs as they picked their way carefully over slippery stones. I paused at the edge and looked back at the path we'd taken, the dust trail fading into the wilderness behind us. My hands rested on the reins, but my mind was tangled in memories that flickered like ghosts. The man dismounted quietly, his boots sinking into the soft mud. Without a word, he began collecting smooth river stones, careful and deliberate. When he turned back to me, he held a single, flat stone out dark and polished by the current. It was an offering, simple but profound. I took the stone and traced its cool surface with a finger. The man nodded once, eyes full of something unspoken. I understood. This was how we spoke now, through gifts, through trust forged in silence. That night, camped beneath a sky stretched wide and clear, I studied the man more closely. The firelight revealed the lines on his face, deep creases carved by years of hardship and loss. His beard was thick and wild, but there was a gentleness in the way his eyes caught the flames. I thought about the cage back in Dust Hollow, the rusted bars, the worn leather bindings. The thought of the townsfolk's cruelty still burned in me. How easy it was for them to forget a man, to cast him out like trash. How easy it was to turn their backs on pain they refused to acknowledge. But this man, this quiet stranger, had survived. Somehow he had carried the weight of those bars within him, and yet here he was, choosing to move forward beside me. As I watched him, I realized I had been doing the same, carrying my own cage, built from grief and fear. I had worn it like armor for so long that I had forgotten what freedom felt like. The night grew colder, and the fire's glow softened. The man reached into his satchel and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth. He set it beside me and unfolded it carefully. Inside were scraps of faded cloth, fragments of a past life, a piece of leather, a torn photograph, a rusty pendant. He didn't speak, but his eyes met mine with a raw honesty that needed no explanation. These were his memories, fragile and scattered, held together by his hands. I reached out and touched the photograph gently. It was a faded portrait of a woman, her smile distant yet familiar. I wondered who she was, what part of his story she held. In return, I laid my hand on the wolf carving, now smoothed by the fire's heat. It was a token of our journey, a symbol of the wildness we both carried beneath the surface. The man's gaze softened, and for a moment, the distance between us shrank. I felt the threads of something new weaving between us, not love, not yet, but the beginnings of trust, fragile and real. The next days passed in a rhythm dictated by the land and the slow healing of two souls intertwined by fate. We moved through canyons where the wind whispered ancient secrets, past abandoned homesteads where the ghosts of old lives lingered in the cracked wood and shattered glass. Each night, the man carved quietly by the fire. Sometimes animals, wolves, ravens, bears, creatures of the wild that embodied the strength and survival instinct we both needed. Other times, he carved simple shapes, hands, faces, symbols whose meanings I could only guess. I learned to watch for the subtle signs of his moods, the way his jaw tightened when a memory pressed too close, the way his eyes darkened with storms I could not yet weather with him. I, too, began to shed pieces of my own armor. The empty pouch that once held my ring hung at the edge of the wagon, a silent testament to the sacrifice I made. In its place, the braid of my hair was tied with a strand of twine, a gift from him. a quiet binding of trust and protection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, I caught a glimpse of something I hadn't seen before: vulnerability. The man sat by the fire, staring into the flames, hands trembling as he carved a new figure. It was a small child, curled in on itself, eyes closed in sleep or sorrow. The carving was rough, but filled with a tenderness that broke through the silence. I wanted to ask who the child was, what pain lay behind those tender lines, but the words caught my throat, swallowed by the fear of opening wounds too raw to heal. Instead, I reached out and placed my hand lightly on his. For a fleeting moment, he didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin seeped through my fingers, and in the silence, a shared understanding blossomed: a recognition of loss, of grief, and the desperate hope for something better. The road stretched before us, unyielding and wild. We were two broken souls moving through a harsh world, bound not by words or promises, but by the fragile thread of companionship. We were not yet free, but for the first time, I believed we might be. The morning fog clung low to the earth as we pressed onward. The landscape around us was a patchwork of cracked plains and distant mesas. The sky, a pale, washed-out canvas that promised heat by midday, but gave us only the cool whisper of early light. I felt the familiar ache in my shoulders, the kind that comes from carrying too much, both in body and in spirit. The man beside me remained wordless, a steady presence in the otherwise hollow quiet. His eyes scanned the horizon constantly, sharp and unyielding, as if searching not just the landscape but something buried deep inside himself. I wondered what shadows chased him in those moments when his gaze hardened and the firelight dimmed in his depths. We moved together, two figures bound by circumstance and necessity, a wagon creaking beneath the weight of our journey and the heavy silence between us. Neither of us spoke, but in those shared silences, a strange kind of understanding began to form, something neither fragile nor fleeting, but slow and sure, like the river carving canyons through stone. We stopped mid-afternoon beside a stand of scrubby juniper, the branches gnarled and twisted like the scars life had left on us both. The man moved with practiced efficiency, unsaddling the horse and breaking branches for kindling. I unpacked our meager provisions: dried beans, stale bread, and a tin cup of weak coffee. It was all we had, but it was enough. The sun beat down mercilessly, burning the dust into the skin and drying the sweat that gathered beneath my hat. I watched the man as he set the fire, his hands sure and deliberate despite their roughness. He had the look of someone who had done this before, not just survival, but living in a way that required constant vigilance and quiet skill. There was a moment when he glanced my way, eyes catching the light with something almost like curiosity. Or was it wariness? I couldn't tell. Whatever it was, it didn't last long. The silence returned, thick and heavy like the heat hanging over the land. That night, the stars were sharp and cold above us. The sky stretched wide and endless. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the man's face as he carved quietly. This time, it was a horse, muscular and wild, mane flying in the wind as if caught in some eternal gallop. I thought about the wildness in both of us, the parts we hid, the parts we couldn't tame. The man's hands moved deftly over the wood, shaping it with care and precision. His eyes were distant, lost in memories I couldn't reach. I reached into my satchel and pulled out a small pouch, empty now, but once holding the ring that had bought me this strange companionship. I tied it carefully to the wagon's frame, a symbol of the past I was learning to leave behind. As I settled down to sleep beside the fire, I thought about the journey we were on, not just through the landscape, but through the tangled web of pain and healing. Neither of us had words for what we carried, but in the silence, something deeper began to grow. The next morning brought a restless wind that rattled the leaves and stoked the fire into bright flames. We packed quickly, the horses restless as if sensing the change in the air. The road stretched on, winding through narrow canyons where the sunlight barely touched the ground. At a bend in the trail, I spotted the ruins of a cabin, charred beams leaning precariously, ashes scattered in the dirt. The man's face darkened as we passed, his eyes fixed on the destruction like it was a wound reopened. That night, under a sky thick with clouds, he carved again. This time, the figure was a tree, its roots tangled and broken, branches reaching skyward in silent desperation. I watched in the firelight as the carving took shape, a symbol that felt too heavy for words. It was as if the man was telling a story through wood, each stroke a confession he couldn't voice aloud. I reached out, placing my hand over his. For a brief moment, his fingers curled around mine, a silent promise that we were no longer alone in this wilderness. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time, I felt the faintest spark of hope flickering in the darkness. We were two lost souls bound by silence, carving out a fragile space where healing might begin. The sun was a relentless overseer, beating down on the trail and baking the dust beneath our weary horses' hooves. The wagon's wheels left furrows in the dry earth, shallow scars marking the passage of two souls bound by unspoken stories. I sat stiffly on the worn leather seat, the weight of my past pressing down, mingling with the heat that wrapped around us like a suffocating shroud. Beside me, the man still without a name, still wrapped in silence, rode with quiet confidence. His dark eyes flicked constantly toward the horizon, as though searching for something beyond the jagged rocks and scorched plains. Every so often, his gaze softened just enough to betray the ache beneath his stoicism. But the walls he'd built around himself remained strong and unmoving. We had been traveling for days now, cutting through a world that seemed to punish those who dared carry burdens. The road was empty, but for the wind's mournful song and the faint clatter of hooves and wagon wheels. The silence between us was heavy, not oppressive, but thick with the weight of things we had not yet dared say. I thought about the ring I had traded, the thin band of gold worn smooth by time, now resting in the hands of a man who spoke only through the language of silence and small gestures. It had been a desperate offering, a currency for freedom, but I hadn't truly understood what I was buying. Not until now. Each evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with bruised oranges and purples, the man would sit beside the fire and carve. His hands moved with practiced skill, shaping pieces of cedar into figures that spoke more than words ever could. Wolves, ravens, hands, faces, each carving was a fragment of his story, a puzzle piece offered cautiously to a stranger who had chosen to stay. On the fourth night, beneath a sky crowded with stars, I watched him work in the flickering firelight. The carving this time was different, a small child curled tightly into itself, eyes closed as if in sleep or sorrow. The image cut through the silence like a whispered confession. I wanted to ask him who the child was, what pain lay behind those tender lines, but the words caught in my throat. Some stories were too raw, too fragile to be spoken aloud. Instead, I reached out and placed my hand lightly over his. His fingers trembled beneath mine, a fragile bridge spanning the distance between two broken souls. The days blended together as we moved forward, the landscape shifting from endless desert to rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. We passed abandoned homesteads, weathered woods sagging under the weight of years, rusted tools tangled in weeds. Ghosts of lives once lived lingered in the air, and I felt the man's eyes darken with unspoken memories each time we neared these places. One afternoon, we came upon a shallow stream, its waters cold and clear, a rare blessing in this dry land. The horses drank eagerly, their breaths steaming in the cool shade of a cottonwood tree. I knelt beside the water and cupped the cool flow to my lips, feeling a fleeting sense of peace. The man joined me, his reflection rippling in the stream. For a moment, his eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something I hadn't dared hope for: trust. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, I pulled out the empty pouch that had once held my ring. I tied it to the wagon's frame, a small symbol of letting go, a silent promise to leave the past behind, or at least carry it lightly. He watched me, eyes steady and unreadable, before reaching into his satchel. From it, he drew a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. Unfolding it carefully, He revealed a collection of worn cloth, a rusted locket, and a faded photograph of a woman smiling gently from a time long past. I traced the edges of the photo, feeling the fragility of his memories in my hands. These relics were all he had left, yet he carried them with reverence, as if they were sacred. In return, I offered him the wolf carving, now worn smooth by firelight and the passage of time. He took it silently, holding it close as if accepting a fragile lifeline. Our journey pressed on, the road twisting through narrow canyons and over rocky ridges. We shared our quiet existence in the language of gestures, a shared blanket against the cold, a fresh piece of bread torn and offered. A glance held a moment longer than necessary. The man's past remained a puzzle, fragments revealed through carvings and relics, but never fully shared. The silence between us was not emptiness, but a space where trust could grow, where two broken souls could heal without words. One morning, we approached a small town, a cluster of wooden buildings pressed close together, smoke curling from chimneys, the distant sound of children laughing. I hesitated at the edge of the settlement, uncertain if we belonged here, if we could ever belong anywhere. The man didn't hesitate. He led the horse down the dusty main street, his posture steady and sure. The townsfolk watched us with wary eyes, whispers trailing in our wake, but no one dared speak aloud. We stopped at the general store, the bell over the door ringing sharp and clear. Inside, the shelves were stocked with flour, coffee, and other staples, a glimpse of normalcy in a harsh world. As I gathered supplies, I felt the man's gaze on me. When I reached into my satchel, my fingers brushed the empty pouch tied to the wagon, a reminder of the price I had paid for this journey. Outside, the sun was high and unforgiving. The man stood silently, a sentinel guarding the fragile piece we had found. I caught his eye, and for a moment, the walls he had built around himself seemed to soften. That night, back at camp, the firelight revealed a new carving, two hands reaching for each other, fingers almost touching, a symbol of connection, of reaching beyond the silence. I reached for his hand again, and this time, he didn't hesitate. Our fingers intertwined, a quiet promise that we would walk this road together, no matter where it led. The journey was far from over, but in that moment, I knew we were no longer alone. The sun had risen and set over us countless times since the day I found him locked away in that cage. And yet, every morning, the world seemed new, like a fresh page torn from a book neither of us had dared to write. We were still travelers on a road that twisted and turned, a path paved with memories too heavy to forget and hopes too fragile to claim. The quiet between us was no longer empty. It was a language built from the smallest of moments, a shared glance, the brush of a hand, the way his gaze softened when the wind carried the scent of rain or the song of a distant bird. I was learning the contours of his silence, and he the contours of my resilience. We had left the town behind, its whispers fading like smoke on the horizon. The open plains stretched endlessly, dust rising from the hooves and the wheels that turned steadily onward. The man, whose name remained a mystery yet felt like a secret I was meant to keep, moved with the ease of someone who belonged to the wild. His carvings were our stories. Each night, beneath the scattered light of stars, he shaped wood into creatures and symbols that spoke of things he could not say. I traced the smooth edges with fingers that had grown familiar with the feel of his hands, rough and steady. One evening, as the fire flickered low, he carved a bird, a raven with wings outstretched, as if caught in the act of taking flight. The image was striking, full of movement and promise. I wondered if it was a message, a sign of escape, or freedom. I offered him a piece of stale bread, torn roughly but given with intent. His fingers closed around it without a word, a silent thank you that carried more weight than any speech. That moment was a balm to a heart long hardened by loss. The land was changing now, rolling hills giving way to dense forests where shadows danced and the air smelled of pine and earth. The horses moved cautiously, ears flicking at sounds I could barely hear. The man led the way on foot at times, his eyes sharp and watchful. One afternoon, we came across an old graveyard, hidden beneath a canopy of twisted oaks. Weathered wooden crosses leaned askew, names faded by years of wind and rain. The silence here was different. It was heavy with memory and reverence. I stepped forward and laid my hand on a sun-bleached stone, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers. The man stood beside me, his presence steady, a shadow beside my own. I thought of all the people we had lost, the chains that bound us, and the courage it took to keep moving forward. That night, by the fire, he carved a figure, a tree with roots deep and branches reaching toward the sky. The image was strong and rooted, a testament to endurance. I traced the lines with my finger, feeling a flicker of hope bloom inside me. Days turned into weeks as we journeyed together, each mile a step away from cages both literal and those we carried within. We learned to read the language of silence, our bond growing in the spaces where words failed. I discovered the small things that spoke volumes, the way he would gather kindling without being asked, the careful tending to the horses, the protective watch he kept as I slept. I, too, found my voice in actions, rather than words, the way I prepared the fire, packed the wagon, and shared what little we had. The nights were the hardest. Shadows lengthened and memories crept in like restless ghosts. There were moments when the man's jaw clenched tight, his hands trembling as he carved a new figure or stared long into the fire. One evening, as the moon hung low and full in the sky, I caught him tracing the worn edges of a locket one I had seen before, hanging from his neck beneath his shirt. The metal was tarnished, but it held a presence that felt sacred. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his in the firelight. He looked at me then, eyes clear and steady. And for the first time, I saw the man beneath the silence, the one who had loved and lost, who had suffered and survived. The road ahead was still long, the future uncertain. But for the first time, I believed that freedom was more than a distant dream. It was here in the quiet companionship of two broken souls, learning to walk again, side by side. And so we traveled on, beneath endless skies and whispered promises, carving out a life from the dust and shadows. The horizon stretched wide before us, a never-ending ribbon of earth and sky that seemed to swallow all hope and fear alike. We traveled through lands that bore the scars of past violence, burnt-out cabins, fields left fallow, and fences broken by storms or neglect. It was a place where ghosts of old grudges lingered like smoke, and the wind carried whispers of what had been lost. I sat atop the wagon, feeling the jolt of the rough trail beneath the wheels, the steady rhythm marking the passage of time. The man rode beside me, his posture rigid but assured, as if every step forward was a battle won against his own demons. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked constantly to the shadows among the trees or the tracks that faded into dust. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was a companion, a thread binding two souls navigating the fragile space between trust and pain. Words were unnecessary, too clumsy to capture what we carried within. We passed a small creek where the water ran clear and cold, a rare mercy in this unforgiving land. The horses drank eagerly while I knelt to wet my face and splash water into my mouth. The man joined me, crouching silently, and for a moment our reflections mingled on the surface, two strangers bound by the quiet ache of survival. That night, beneath a sky thick with stars, the man carved again by the fire's glow. His hands worked steadily, shaping a small, intricate figure of a bird wings spread wide as if caught mid-flight, freedom captured in wood. I traced the edges with my fingers, feeling the grain beneath my skin, and understood without words the message he was sending. Escape, hope, rebirth. I reached out and placed a piece of bread in his palm, a gesture that had become our language. Fingers closed around it, and he nodded once. A silent thank you that echoed louder than any speech. The road ahead twisted through narrow canyons where the sun struggled to reach the earth and shadows danced like restless spirits. The horses picked their way carefully over rocky paths, and the man led with a quiet confidence that belied the scars hidden beneath his calm exterior. One afternoon, we came across the ruins of a small homestead, charred timbers and shattered glass, a testament to a life ended too soon. The man paused, his eyes darkening with memories I could only guess at. He knelt beside the ashes and traced a pattern in the dirt, a tree with branches reaching upward, roots tangled deep below. The fire that night was smaller, the silence heavier. Yet in that stillness, something shifted between us. The man reached out and took my hand, fingers intertwining with mine in a grip that spoke of shared burdens and fragile hope. I squeezed back, a promise made in the language of touch. Days turned to weeks, and the landscape changed again. We crossed rolling hills carpeted with wildflowers, their colors bright against the dusty earth. The air smelled sweeter here, filled with the song of birds and the rustle of leaves. For the first time in a long while, the weight inside me felt lighter. At a small town nestled in the valley, we stopped to rest. The streets were alive with children's laughter and the chatter of neighbors. I felt eyes on us, curious, wary, sometimes harsh. The man stood silent beside the wagon, shoulders squared against the judgment that followed us like a shadow. Inside the general store, I bought coffee and flour while he waited outside. When I returned, he reached into his pouch and pulled out a faded photograph, a woman's face smiling gently from a time long gone. He showed it to me briefly before tucking it away. A sacred relic of a life I would never fully understand. That night, as the fire flickered low, he carved again. This time, the figure was a pair of hands reaching out, one open, one closed, a symbol of giving and receiving, of trust and letting go. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. The road was still long and uncertain, but together we were finding a way through the darkness. In the days that followed, we moved steadily eastward, the sun rising and setting like a silent witness to our journey. The man, once a stranger locked behind iron bars, had become my companion in silence, his presence a balm to the wounds we both carried. Sometimes, when the night was deep and the fire low, I thought about the life I had left behind, the ring I had traded, the pain I had tried to bury, and I wondered if this strange, quiet man was my salvation or my undoing. But as the stars wheeled overhead and the coyotes howled in the distance, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer alone. The dawn crept over the ridge like a soft breath, painting the sky with pale hues of pink and gold. The camp stirred slowly, horses pawing the earth, the faint crackle of the dying fire, the quiet shuffle of two souls waking to face another day on the road. The man was already moving, his figure outlined against the early light, sturdy and silent as ever. I watched him from the wagon, the weight of everything that had brought us here pressing down. The ring in my satchel felt heavier than it had when I first gave it up. It wasn't just metal, it was a symbol, a tether to a past life I was learning to let go of, strand by strand. We packed up quickly, the routine of our journey steady and unchanging. There was a strange comfort in the repetition, the careful folding of blankets, the checking of supplies, the slow settling of horses into their harnesses. It was the rhythm of survival, a language spoken without words. As we moved forward, the landscape shifted once more. The dusty plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and the occasional scraggly tree. The air was cooler here, scented with pine and earth, and the sky stretched wide and open above us. The man rode beside me, his gaze steady on the horizon. Sometimes, he would reach into his satchel and pull out one of his carvings, small wooden figures, each one a fragment of the story he couldn't or wouldn't tell. I carried them carefully, like sacred relics, tracing the lines with my fingers as if I could read the secrets hidden within the grain. One evening, we came to a narrow canyon, the walls towering and rough, casting long shadows across the path. The horses hesitated, their hooves scraping on loose stones. The man dismounted, walking ahead to scout the way, his steps sure and deliberate. I followed at a distance, heart pounding as the silence grew thick around us. The canyon felt alive with whispers, echoes of the past, memories trapped in stone and shadow. I thought of the cage he had been locked in, the bars that had held him captive not just in body but in spirit. That night, as we camped beneath the stars, the man carved again. This time, It was a figure of a bird caught in a cage, wings spread wide but unable to fly. The image struck a chord deep within me, a reflection of the journey we both shared. I reached out, placing my hand over his, the roughness of his skin grounding me. The silence between us spoke volumes of promise that we were no longer prisoners of our pasts. Days passed like this, the road unfolding beneath us like a ribbon of dust and dreams. The man's past remained a mystery, revealed only in fragments: the carvings, the relics he carried, the haunted look in his eyes when the night grew dark. I shared my own stories in small ways: the way I tended the fire, the meals I prepared from sparse provisions, the careful packing of the wagon. Each gesture was a thread woven into the fragile tapestry we were creating together. At times, I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye, a softness there that belied the hardness he wore like armor. There were moments when the silence between us seemed to hum with unspoken understanding, a connection deeper than words could reach. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened, we reached a small town nestled in a valley. The buildings were weathered but alive, smoke curling from chimneys, children playing in the streets. I hesitated at the edge of the settlement, the weight of years pressing down like a storm cloud. The man didn't hesitate. He led the horses down the dusty main street, his presence calm and commanding. The townsfolk watched us with wary eyes, whispers following in our wake, but no open hostility. We stopped at the general store, the bell ringing sharp and clear as I stepped inside. I gathered supplies: flour, coffee, salted meat, while the man waited silently outside. When I returned, he pulled from his pouch a small, tarnished locket, the same one he had shown me before. Inside was a faded photograph, a woman's face smiling gently from a time long past. He tucked it away again, his eyes dark with memories I would never fully understand. I reached out, brushing my fingers against his in a rare moment of courage. His grip was firm, a silent thank you that spoke louder than words. That night, by the fire, he carved a new figure, a pair of hands, one open and one closed, reaching toward each other. It was a symbol of trust, of giving and receiving. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. The road was still long and uncertain, but together we were finding a way through the darkness. The dawn broke slow and heavy, like the world itself was still waking from a long, restless sleep. The horizon bled faint hues of orange and rose, painting the sky with promises that felt distant yet unyielding. I sat by the fire, the embers cooling beneath my hands, the quiet hum of the morning stirring all around. The man was already awake, standing near the horses with a stillness that seemed almost sacred, the weight of unspoken memories pressing in on the edges of the new day. Our journey had stretched on longer than I had ever imagined it could, a river winding through shadows and sunlight, pain and hope tangled like vines beneath the surface. He was still a mystery, wrapped in silence and secrets, but the space between us was no longer hollow. It was a refuge. We packed slowly, the ritual of breaking camp grounding me. I moved through the motions, folding blankets, loading supplies, checking the horses, each task a tether to the present, to this fragile life we were building on the edge of the world. The man moved with me in quiet harmony, a ghost beside my living shadow. The road ahead twisted through valleys and ridges, sometimes narrow and steep, sometimes wide and open. The land bore the marks of time-old wounds carved into earth and stone, reminders of what had been lost and what still lingered beneath the surface. It was a harsh place, but there was a wild beauty to it, the kind that spoke to something deep and untamed in the soul. We traveled without much need for words, the silence between us heavy with meaning. I had learned to read the subtle language of his glances, the slight shifts in his posture, the way his eyes would sometimes soften when the sun caught the glint of something buried deep inside. He carried his past like a shadow, always there, never fully revealed, but I saw the cracks where light seeped through. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long golden fingers across the dust, we came upon a river. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones with a soothing murmur. The horses drank eagerly, their thirsty sighs filling the quiet space. I knelt by the bank, dipping my hands into the icy current, letting the chill chase away the heat and dust of the day. The man sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a carving an eagle in mid-flight. Wings stretched wide, fierce and free. I traced the lines with my fingers, feeling the rough grain beneath my skin, a testament to strength and survival. I wanted to ask him about it, about the stories behind the figures he carved with such care, but the words caught in my throat. Some things were better left unspoken, understood in the quiet exchange of presence. That night, by the firelight, he carved again a pair of hands clasped tightly, a symbol of trust and unbreakable bond. I watched as the shadows flickered across his face, the lines of pain and hope etched deep into his skin. I reached out, placing my hand gently over his, a silent promise that we were no longer alone. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of peace. Days turned into weeks. The road stretched endless before us, a ribbon of dust and dreams woven beneath the endless sky. We crossed rugged mountains where the air was thin and sharp, and vast deserts where the heat shimmered on the horizon like a mirage. Each mile carried us further from the cages of our past, those iron bars not just of metal, but of memory and fear. The man, whose name I still did not know, was my companion in silence, a steady presence that filled the spaces where words failed. He cooked without being asked, tended the horses with quiet care, and carved stories from wood like a man trying to piece together a shattered life. I, too, found my voice in actions rather than speech. The way I packed the wagon, built the fire, and shared what little we had became a language of survival and trust. Sometimes when the night was deep and the world held its breath, I caught him watching me with eyes that held something softer than suspicion, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through. One afternoon, we came upon a town nestled in a valley, a place alive with laughter and life. Children played barefoot in the streets, and the scent of baking bread filled the air. The man led the horses through the dusty main street, his shoulders squared against the curious gazes and whispered questions. I followed, the weight of years pressing down, but also a strange new lightness, a feeling that we were no longer fugitives from ourselves. Inside the general store, I gathered supplies: flour, coffee, salted meat, while he waited silently outside. When I returned, he pulled from his pouch a small, worn photograph, a woman's face, smiling gently from a time long past. He showed it to me briefly before tucking it away, a sacred relic of a life I would never fully understand. That night, as the fire flickered low, he carved a new figure, a tree with deep roots and reaching branches, a symbol of endurance and hope. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. The road was still long and uncertain, but together we were finding a way through the darkness. But even in moments of peace, the past was never far behind. One morning, as the mist curled over the hills like ghosts of forgotten days, we were ambushed. It was sudden, horses galloping from the brush, voices shouting orders, the crack of gunfire echoing through the valley. I scrambled to grab the reins, heart hammering, as the man sprang into action, his movements fluid and precise. We fought with everything we had, the dust swirling around us like a storm. I felt the heat of a bullet whiz past, smelled the acrid smoke of gunpowder, and saw the determination in his eyes, a fire that refused to be snuffed out. When the dust settled, we were battered but alive. The attackers had fled, leaving behind broken branches and shattered silence. We tended to wounds, his hands steady as he cleaned a gash on my arm, my fingers trembling as I pressed cloth to his shoulder. There were no words, just the language of pain and care, of survival and shared battle. That night, the carvings told a new story: a broken sword mended, a heart wrapped in vines, a promise carved into wood. I traced each line with my fingertips, feeling the weight of what had been lost and what we still held on to. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: We were no longer running from shadows alone. We were fighting to reclaim the light. As dawn broke, I looked at him, the man who had come from a cage, who spoke in silence, who carried the past like a ghost, but moved with the strength of a storm. And I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. The sun hung low over the horizon, burning through the thinning haze like a last flicker of a dying flame. The wind was sharp, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust, whispering secrets through the sparse branches that clung stubbornly to the cracked earth. We had traveled far through canyons that held shadows deeper than night, across plains where the earth seemed endless and unforgiving, but the road had brought us here, to this place where everything would change. I looked over at him, the man who had once been caged and broken, whose silence had spoken more than any words ever could. The years carved into his face like the landscape itself, the eyes, dark, unreadable, held a new light now. A quiet fire that no prison or past could snuff out. He was no longer just a shadow from my past, nor a stranger bound by silence. He was a companion forged in pain, resilience, and unspoken trust. The cabin stood before us, half swallowed by the wild. Weathered wood and crooked nails, but alive, a home waiting to be claimed, not just by blood or law, but by the will to rebuild, to start anew. It was a far cry from the cage and the road, but it was ours now, a blank slate painted with every step we had taken together. I stepped down from the wagon, my boots stirring up dust that danced like spirits in the late afternoon light. He was behind me, silent as ever, hands resting casually on the reins but ready, always ready. The air was heavy, with expectation not of fear, but of something unspoken and profound. Inside the cabin, the floorboards creaked beneath my weight, the faint scent of cedar and earth filling the hollow space. I ran my fingers over the rough wood, imagining the life that could bloom here, faint echoes of laughter, the soft warmth of a fire burning in the hearth, the steady rhythm of two lives weaving together. He settled beside me, the quiet hum of his presence filling the empty spaces. For a moment, I felt the weight of the past, the cages, the scars, the silent battles lift, replaced by something lighter, a fragile hope wrapped in the promise of this shared sanctuary. That night, beneath a sky so vast and star-studded it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, we sat by the fire. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the carvings he had made over the months: the wolf, the bird, the clasped hands, the tree with deep roots, all symbols of survival, trust, and connection. I traced my fingers over the wooden hand he had carved for me, the one that mirrored my own open, reaching, ready to hold and be held. He reached out slowly, his rough fingers brushing against mine, a touch that spoke of battles fought and peace found. Words still eluded him, but they were unnecessary. Our bond had grown beyond language, built on small gestures: the braid he tied gently at the nape of my neck, the way he gathered firewood before I even noticed the pile shrinking, the shared silence that held more comfort than any spoken promise. In the quiet hours, I let down my guard. I told my story not in words, but in the soft sighs that escaped me, in the way my hands trembled as I held the ring I had once pawned, now replaced by a new kind of symbol, tied into my hair alongside the beads he carved for me. Each one marked a step of healing, a fragment of trust, a piece of a life rebuilt from ashes. He listened, not with ears, but with heart and soul, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, the unspoken understanding that we were both scarred, both survivors, both searching for a way to live beyond the cages we had known. The days grew warmer, the land blooming with the wild iris and the hum of new life. We planted a garden near the creek, the soil rich and forgiving, the water singing a song of hope. The horses grazed peacefully, their steady presence a reminder of the journey and the freedom won. Sometimes, I caught him staring out toward the horizon, his face unreadable but softening in the glow of dawn. I wanted to ask about the past, the fire, the loss, the silence, but I knew some stories were locked away for a reason, held safe in the sacred spaces between us. One evening, he took a small knife and carved a final piece, a simple circle with no beginning and no end, a symbol of the unbroken bond we had forged. He pressed it into my palm, a gift without words, but with all the meaning I could ever need. I clasped his hand then, steady and sure, no longer afraid to reach out, no longer bound by the chains of solitude. Together, we stood at the edge of the world we had reclaimed, two souls unbroken, two lives braided together not by fate, but by choice. The cage had been left far behind, a distant memory outshone by the light we carried now. It was not the absence of scars that defined us, but the courage to live despite them, the quiet strength found in shared silence, the deep trust born of simply being seen. As the sun set behind the ridge, painting the sky with colors too fierce and beautiful for words, I knew this was home, not a place, but a promise. A promise that even in the wildest, loneliest corners of the world, healing was possible, and no one had to face the darkness alone. We had traded a ring for freedom, silence for trust, loneliness for companionship. And in that trade, we found something neither of us had dared to hope for: a future. The road goes on. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the journey feels like belonging. If you were in the lead shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on screen for more stories that will stay with you long after the last word.